Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're just waiting to see. I think there's a couple more people joining at the moment, but we'll get started anyway. So thank you for joining us for this webinar today. I'm joined by David Johnson from Halo Financial, who will start off the webinar talking with you about currency conversion, and then I'll go through some of the other financial maths, including the pension transfers side of things for Australia as well. So yeah, just a quick slide, just to say it's for information only. Nothing that we say today is financial advice. You can contact us afterwards though to ask any questions. We'll also have a Q&A at the end. There's a chat function on here, but also a Q&A. If you can use the Q&A ideally, then pop any questions in there. We'll come back and we'll give some time to you at the end to go through those questions. So just to introduce us a little bit, I'm Paul Lawson-Tyers. I've been with BGH Sterling for 13 years now, but I've been in the financial services industry for 30 years, and I specialise in helping people to move to various countries, but mainly Australia. And David is well, you're joined by the head of Halo Financial here, and he's similarly got over 30 years experience as well, and obviously both of us have the necessary qualifications in order to be able to provide you with advice. So yeah, today's agenda is, as I said, first of all, David taking you through Halo Financial, and then I will go through the types of pensions, why you might want to look at transferring to them Australia, some of the advantages, some of the disadvantages, and explain to you about the types of pension that you have to transfer to abroad, QROPs, how we go through the transfer process, and just a bit about ourselves. So as I said, there will be a Q&A at the end, so if you can pop your questions in there, we'll go through those questions at the end. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody, and good evening, I should say, because most of you, I think, are in Australasia. This little piece I've done is largely directed at the sterling Australian dollar exchange rate. I understand there are a few people joining who are based in New Zealand. I haven't concentrated on that, but if there's anything you need me to cover, then put something in the Q&A, or my contact details will be available. So drop me a line. I can cover that with you directly, or introduce you to somebody in our private client team who can do that. This is all about helping you to transfer funds from UK to Australia and vice versa. And there's often a case where people are moving money back as well. To be fair, at the start of a migration process, and you know, when you're getting visas sorted and you're getting yourself settled and what have you, currency might not be the top of your agenda. It is something to look at from early on, though, because it will have an impact on the monies you receive when you arrive in Australia, and what you can do with those funds. And there are a number of ways to make sure you take advantage of the movement in exchange rates in order to capitalize on that. I should now say, next slide, please, because Paul is controlling things. Feel like Chris Whitty. So factors that affect exchange rates, there are mostly economic and geopolitical factors that will have an impact on exchange rates. There's a few here. I haven't added in the Arab-Israeli conflict that's carrying on at the moment, because it doesn't have a direct impact on economic activity, but it does have an impact, I guess, on the value of the US dollar, which is heavily influenced by international investors moving money around and looking for safe havens at the time of geopolitical problems. If there is any escalation beyond Israel and the Palestinians, then that may well have a direct impact. If the US dollar strengthens, the rule of thumb is that the Australian dollar tends to weaken. Best example of that was during the 2020 pandemic. The US dollar strengthened up immediately, and we had the luxury of sterling Aussie dollar exchange rates over 2 to the pound, which was very exciting and really, really very helpful to people who were moving at the time. So there's a, oh, sorry. Commodities have a direct impact, particularly on the Australian dollar. As you'll probably know, Australia is a big exporter of raw materials, raw iron ore and bauxite and the likes. If commodities are expensive, and they are expensive at the moment, partly due to the Russia-Ukraine war, then you tend to find the Australian dollar strengthens up on the back of that because the value of their exports goes up. Central banks have a very direct impact on the value of currencies. At the moment, the Australian base rate is running at 4.35%, which is quite low by international standards. UK base rate a bit higher at 5.25%. The banks are in slightly different position, largely due to inflation and their unemployment rates and what have you. Australian inflation has ticked up to 4%, which was a bit unexpected, I have to say, and caught the markets a bit by surprise. It does mean that the Reserve Bank of Australia might actually raise interest rates when other central banks are definitely on a ticket to reduce their base rates. So we may well see a rise of interest rates in Australia before the first cut. It's a slightly different picture in the UK. The Bank of England has seen inflation come down to its target rate of 2%, which ought to mean they're cutting interest rates. What we're not seeing yet is any appetite to do that. The markets are starting to factor that into August, perhaps. A lower interest rate would certainly weaken sterling, and that's something to be aware of. COVID-19 has slightly, has played out of things by now, but we're still seeing the lagging effects of that, in as much as it had such an enormous impact on capacity and manufacturing and what have you, haven't really recovered, even 3-4 years on. So there is still a sort of lagging impact of the pandemic. Brexit is an ongoing thing. As you're very aware, I'm sure, we have an election in the UK on the 4th of July. The outcome is looking even more complicated than we imagined it might be, with the Reform Party seeming to be marching higher and higher up the polls. Their commitment to fully deliver on Brexit is an interesting one, and that will have an impact on the value of the pound. Initially, that is likely to be a negative impact if this is a big if the Reform Party is successful in gathering enough seats. But if in power, their commitment is to deliver Brexit in its fullest, therefore removing the UK from the ECHR, removing us from the World Health Organization, stepping away from the World Economic Forum. All of those things will initially be seen as negative. There's no doubt about that, but could well be positive in the longer term. It's a very unknowable unknown, but we'll see how that plays out. I've mentioned trade wars here. There is, a brewing concern over US-China tension over trade, and certainly, obviously, the US election may well deliver Donald Trump into power, who is very anti the way that China operates as a protectionist economy. It may well be that if we move to there, we'll get if Trump is successful, we may well see some pressures from that, and how that plays out into the value of the US dollar and therefore impacts on other currencies is another matter. And I've mentioned global economic stability. Well, there is never global economic stability, but the influence of various countries on the value of currencies is obviously ever present. I think, sorry, next slide, if you would, please, Paul. I think it's worth just a quick look at the sterling Aussie dollar chart and some impression of how volatile it can be. I mentioned the COVID impact pushing sterling Oz up to 208 at one point. We would dream of that now. And whilst we have been all the way down to sort of 165 at one point, we're back up somewhere near the top end of that, 190.40 when I put this chart together. I haven't looked at the pricing this morning. I've been too busy getting ready for this, but we're around that this morning. as I say, there are quite a lot of things that are going to happen over the next few weeks, which will have an impact. But you can obviously see the enormous difference that can make to your spending power in Australia if you're moving funds from the UK. And the next slide, we'll start to talk about how you can take advantage of those things. Also, sorry, no, this talks about how wonderful we are. So we're specialised in currency. We've worked with BDH from their inception in helping their clients to handle their foreign exchange requirements. What we provide is guidance and analysis on the markets and understanding of how market conditions will impact your financial situation. And we offer the opportunity to book rates in advance and to manage your currency transactions in the best way possible. We're regulated by the FCA in order to do this, and we've had some increased variation of permission on that regulation in the last year, which allows us to now offer virtual IBANs, which is something that may or may not work for you, but we won't discuss it here today. And also we can handle payments through what we call pay by bank, or the banking system where you pay through your banking app rather than having to make a separate transfer, which I think is a big advantage, particularly when you're working across continents. Sorry, next slide. We'll talk about the things we can do regarding currency. So ultimately, the timing of your transaction is the major impact on the currency exchange rate you're going to receive. We can't make the markets do what we want them to do. It'd be lovely if we could. We'd be multi-millionaires. But what we can do is take advantage of the fluctuations in the market movement, make you aware of those movements, and if we know that you've got money to move into Australian dollars, make sure you're aware when we're at the top end of that range, or if there's something on the horizon that might change the position on that. Once you've decided that this exchange rate I can see now is the one I want to use, then there's a number of things you can do. You can either put in what's known as a spot contract, which is an agreement to buy on the spot, as it were. So you would agree an exchange rate today. We would receive from you your sterling. You would tell us where the Australian dollars need to be deposited, and we send that on to the beneficiary on receipt of your funds. And that soonest that can happen with sterling Aussie is next day, but normally they are 2-day contracts to allow for the movement of funds. So on the graphic, somebody's put trade now, pay now, just because obviously you wouldn't understand all that. I think that's a little bit simplistic, but I think you'd understand all of that. On forward contracts, buy now, pay later is on the graphic. It's basically about agreeing an exchange rate now for a future date. So if the exchange rate is particularly attractive, if we got to 2 Aussie to the pound again, which obviously we're not that far away from, but if we got to that sort of level and you thought, well, I absolutely need to take advantage of this, then we can agree an exchange rate at that point and agree a value date in the future. So if your funds aren't going to be released from a house sale, or they're coming out of an investment, or it's part of your pension pot and needs to be moved around, then we can agree an exchange rate today for a future value date up to 2 years ahead, I should say. And for the payment of a deposit against that, then you fix that exchange rate and you've got that guarantee. It's only to be used where you absolutely know the money is going to be available at a certain date in the future. And it's absolutely only to be used when you know you've got your visa and you definitely are going, and there's no doubt about that. If you're having to unwind an international move and pension transfers and all that stuff, and you've got a foreign currency transaction to unwind as well, it's the last thing you really need. In order to get the right exchange rate, you can use a thing called market orders. They're either stop loss or limit orders. In the speculative market, people use them to limit their risk or to take advantage of spikes in the exchange rate. We use them slightly differently. We use them to make sure that if you're targeting 2 Aussie dollars to the pounds, let's say, and you want to put an order in the market so that if it does spike there on the overnight market, as far as the UK is concerned, which is very likely because obviously Australia trades a different set of hours, then you can place an order to take advantage of that spike, even if you're not contactable or we're not contactable. That's placed in the order with a market maker, and then we would contact you the next morning to say, the order's been triggered. Do you want a spot contract? Do you want a forward contract? And we'd agree the details of that. So it's a very good way to take advantage of spikes that occur when you're not looking. A stop loss order is slightly different. It's a situation where if you cannot make that transfer at less than 1.88, let's say 1.88 to the pound, then you can put an order in the market that says if the market drops, if the exchange rate drops, and we trigger that at 1.88, your order is booked. And again, we have the same conversation about whether it's a spot or a forward contract you want to put in place, but at least you've got that guarantee. It's only really worth doing if that's an absolute stopper in your plans, but it certainly does allow you to guarantee a minimum exchange rate, whatever happens. Businesses tend to use those for if they're costing goods for resale and they need to be able to agree an exchange rate in order to fix their sales price. Businesses use that for that, so they've got a guaranteed minimum level on the exchange rate that guarantees their minimum return on investment. On the next slide, I can't remember which order these come in. Top tips. So what we have here is really what I said earlier. It's really worthwhile having a look at your currency requirements well in advance. You might not need to do anything, but at least you've got all of your ideas together and you've got all your ducks in a row. As and when you absolutely do need to move some money, or the exchange rate is too tempting for you to not take advantage of it, then you can do that with plenty of time to spare. So really, please don't leave currency to the last minute. We'd much rather have a conversation with you that isn't going to come to anything for a year, rather than a phone call to say, I've got to move some Aussie, they need to be there tomorrow, and we find the exchange rate is awful. So, we'd much rather do it the other way around. As I mentioned earlier, please don't buy currency until you've absolutely secured your visa. You know that everything is happening and you can start to make plans to physically move your money. The other part of that is registering with Halo costs nothing. It's purely about getting the know your client and the regulatory stuff out of the way, and getting you up and ready to go, so that when you do need to move money, there isn't a delay while we sort the paperwork out. And we deliver on a daily basis a market update, which covers sort of the general market conditions and any major influences the moving around in the market. And as I say, this has been very much about the Australian dollar and the UK. If you do need information about New Zealand or any other destination for that matter, then let us know and we can make sure that we're providing you updates and information on that as well. I think that is the last for me. There is a mention there of our contact that works directly with BDH, as Geraldine Collett. Geraldine is largely based in the UK, but she does travel, so but she is certainly the person to contact if you have any particular queries. If you need anything relating to the market movements and the currency exchange rates, then I'm a better option, and I can either do that or I can put you in touch with somebody on our private client desk who will do that for you. I think I've run over a bit, Paul. My apologies for that.
No, it's not a problem at all. Thank you, David. I would just add one thing that David's slightly undersold, I think, Halo in one respect, and that's a lot of people think, well, I just transfer my money from the bank in the UK to the bank in Australia, and it will just be converted by the bank. One thing about using a currency broker is that there's a rate, an interbank rate that all these institutions buy their currency at, and then there's the rate that they sell it to you at. Very often the banks will be taking 3, 4, 5% off of that interbank rate, whereas with a currency broker you will get a lot closer to it, and that's how they make money. But they're dealing with much larger transactions in general than the banks are. It's not a core part of the bank's business. So yeah, using a currency broker, even when you're just using that spot rate, the daily rate, then you'll get a much better deal. Just using that, let alone using the other facilities that David took you through. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, David?
Absolutely. I'll get you to do the presentation next time, Paul, because I didn't forget to mention them. Good work.
I've been with Halo for long enough. taking you on now to what we do at BDH Sterling. As I said, it will mainly be around pensions and why transfer them. So if you've got any other questions on the financial side of things, so pop them in the Q&A and we'll go through them at the end. So first of all, types of pensions and why transfer. So pensions in the UK are broadly split between two different types. So you've got your defined contribution and your defined benefit. So defined contribution, often called a money purchase pension, is where you pay contributions into a scheme. It's invested. The investments will fluctuate according to the markets, and then when you get to retirement, you've got a pot that you can then either hand over to buy a guaranteed income in your retirement, an annuity, or you can just draw from that pension and manage the investments and the withdrawals during your retirement. So generally that's a personal pension, self-invested personal pension, group personal pension, those sort of things. A defined benefit does what it says on the tin. You have a defined benefit, so you have a defined annual pension. So you'll find that they used to be final salary schemes. A lot of them are more sort of career average salary ones now, but basically you don't have a fund, you don't have investments fluctuating, you just have a guaranteed income, and that usually will increase along the lines of inflation. It will include a spouse's pension, etc. So you can go and get a value from them, a transfer value, so they will make a calculation as to what they deem to be a reasonable amount for you to transfer to another scheme. And when you get that valuation, as long as you've previously left that scheme, so you have what's called deferred benefits, you will get a valuation that is then guaranteed for 3 months, and then we can work with that to help you to establish whether or not it makes sense for you to transfer onto that scheme. So if you're transferring out, you'll be going into a defined contribution type scheme, and the schemes that we would look at transferring to in Australia would be defined contribution schemes. So you will be subject to those investment fluctuations, but I'll take you through that a little bit during the course of this webinar. So the types of transfers that we can make to Australia. So the defined contribution that I was talking about just now, defined benefit in general, but there are some, and this is where it's going to disappoint some of you, I'm sure, there are some unfunded public sector schemes. So things like the NHS pension scheme. I think the next slide actually shows which ones they are. But there are some that are classed as funded. So what we mean by unfunded and funded is that an unfunded public sector scheme is one where, although contributions are paid, etc., they don't ring fence a fund that they use to provide those benefits. It just goes into the general sort of government coffers, if you like, and they can calculate roughly how much they're going to have to pay out each year, and that's how that works. But with the funded public sector scheme, so for example, the local government pension scheme, they will have ring-fence funds. So that's why the local government pension scheme is split into various different schemes. So, for example, the Greater Manchester pension scheme or other ones like that, they will have specific names wherever you are, and that's because they have their own fund. They manage the investments behind the scenes. It doesn't affect your benefits, but basically it means that they can offer transfer values. Whereas the unfunded ones, ever since 2015, when some changes were made to pensions, they can't be transferred. Also, QROPs qualify and recognise overseas pension schemes. So if you already have one of those in another country and you're now looking to move it to Australia, then we can move that as well. When we do eventually make it a transfer of any of these schemes to an Australian scheme, it's one that has to have QROP status. So there are some slides later, so I won't labour the point at the moment, but it's basically it's an HMRC permission that they can accept UK funds, and they have to adhere to certain rules as a result. And then some people will have a qualifying non-UK pension scheme. They're quite few and far between, but if you have one, then we can certainly help you with that as well. Types of pensions that can't be transferred. First of all, the UK state pension. So as long as you've paid at least 10 years worth of contributions, you will be entitled to some UK pension scheme, 35 years for the maximum. And you can't transfer it to Australia, but you will still be entitled to it. And generally, my clients have that paid into a UK bank account, and they use Halo to transfer the funds over to Australia so that they can control the timing of that transaction and get a much better deal on that exchange rate. Government unfunded pensions. So I already mentioned about the NHS teachers. There are 6 main ones that are included within those ones that can't be transferred. NHS, teachers, armed forces, police, firefighters, and civil service pension schemes. So if you're a member of any of those, unfortunately, those benefits will have to stay in the UK. Again, you'll be entitled to them when you get to retirement, but you won't be able to physically transfer the whole pot over to an Australian scheme. If you're unlucky enough for your pension to have entered the pension protection fund, then that is also unfortunately not transferable. You'd know about pension protection fund if you're in it. And then if you've bought an annuity already in the UK, then you will have already handed over your pension pot in return for a guaranteed income. And once that income's in place, that can't be transferred as a whole pot. Again, you'll still be able to draw the income. Okay, so why transferring your pension may not be suitable. So with a defined benefit type scheme, public final salary career average that I talked about earlier, the starting assumption from the FCA is that it's not a good idea to transfer. Now that legislation is written for somebody that's remaining in the UK, but we still need to be very careful. If you're going to give up that guaranteed pension that I talked about earlier to transfer over to an Australian scheme, then you need to be sure that new scheme over there with all the investments, etc., will be suitable to you, will give you a better result. I'm going to apologise at this stage. I'm just going to turn off my audio and video and come back to you in a second. I need to shut my window because there's quite a lot of noise outside. So just bear with me. I do apologise about that. It's not particularly professional, but it was very off-putting for me. So if you are going to transfer over there, we need to do some proper projections and make sure that if you've got that transfer value that I talked about earlier, and you're going to transfer over there, that new scheme is going to be better for you. Now, one thing that hasn't been covered in these slides at the moment is why it might be a good idea to transfer. It will be covered a little bit in the next one, but essentially, if you have your funds in Australia and you're drawing from an Australian scheme during your retirement, all the benefits that you receive will be tax-free. Whereas if you draw from your UK scheme, you will be taxed on it in Australia. So from that point of view, when we're looking at moving out of a defined benefit type scheme, we're not comparing taxable benefits to taxable benefits like you might in the UK. We are comparing taxable benefits to tax-free benefits in Australia. So it does change those projections, but we still need to be very careful that if you're giving up a guaranteed income, that it is likely to benefit you in the long run. Another advantage is that you can move the funds into Australian dollars, so you've got your whole pot in Australian dollars and you're not having to worry about currency going forward. It's not always cost tax effective. Say about that tax advantage over there, it might be that when we do those projections, your fund in the UK, your income in the UK is actually going to be higher even after you pay some tax than the tax-free income over there. In terms of defined contribution type schemes, those ones that have already invested, then you'll be moving to a scheme that's invested in Australia as well. But there might be, for example, transfer penalties on your fund in the UK. And we need to be sure that if you're going to transfer it, that again, it's going to be right for you. It might be that those transfer penalties drop off nearer to retirement, and that might be a better time to move it. So we need to assess all of this for you. Your current UK scheme might be performing particularly well on the investments, and we might not be able to match those types of investment that you're in an Australian scheme. So that might be another thing that we need to consider. So we will get full details of how your scheme is invested. I'm talking about defined contribution schemes here, the money purchase ones, like personal pensions, etc. We need to look at that as well. So whenever we're working with anybody, we will get full details of the pension scheme that they're in, so that we can do all of these proper assessments and work out whether it is suitable or not. But this is just giving you an idea that there are some things that we need to consider. The last thing here is not comfortable transferring the investment risk from your employer to yourself. So if you've got one of these defined benefit schemes, as I said, you've got a guaranteed annual income. You don't have to worry about the investments that are going on behind the scenes. That's this scheme administrator's problem or your employer's problem. So if you transfer over to Australia, you will be in an invested scheme, and your investments will fluctuate. So that needs to be something that you're comfortable with as well. You will be able to buy an annual pension over there, an annuity, and generally Australian annuity rates have been better than the UK over the years. So that is still an option, but there might be a period between transferring out of your defined benefit scheme and then buying a guaranteed income in Australia, where you would be subject to those investment risks. So why consider transferring? So I've already said about the different tax environment over there. So just to explain that a little bit better, in the UK, you get contribution, you pay contributions, you get tax relief on them, and then your investments, they grow in the tax-free environment. But when you get to retirement, you only get 25% back as a tax-free lump sum, and the rest is a taxable income. In Australia, they don't give you nearly the level of tax relief on your contribution. You can pay something called a concessional contribution, and that comes off of your salary and goes into the superannuation, as they call pensions over there. It goes into the superannuation, and it's taxed at 15% when it goes into the superannuation. So that might be less than the tax that you would have paid if you received that as income, but it's not the same sort of level of tax relief as you get in the UK. While funds are in growth over there, they are taxed as they go along at 15%. But because the Australian government hasn't given you a whole load of tax incentives along the way, it means that when you get to retirement, they allow you to receive everything tax-free. So, there really is an advantage from that point of view. Currency control we've got on here, I mentioned that earlier. It's an opportunity to move all of your funds into Australian dollars. So that's a real advantage. That's the currency you're going to be living in. It helps your budgeting. It also takes one of the elements of risk off the table. As I said, you're going to have investment risk. So taking the currency risk off the table as well is a good thing. And again, we can get very competitive rates by using Halo to do that for you. Estate planning, as far as pensions are concerned, in the UK, when you reach age 75, benefits that go to your beneficiaries after 75 will be taxable. If you move your funds to Australia, there's the opportunity to be able for your beneficiaries to be able to receive those benefits tax-free, whatever age you are. And investment control as well. So it may be quite difficult, for example, for you to manage the investments from Australia that you've got in your UK scheme. The investments in Australia might be more suitable to the economic environment that you're living in as well. So there can be some advantages from that point of view. I've already gone through treatment on this next one. Another advantage is during this process, when you emigrate, there's the opportunity to sort out a lot of things that you've never got round to. So, for example, decluttering your house. A lot of people end up doing that because it's going to cost them money to have to transport too much stuff. So it's the same with your finances as well. It's the opportunity where maybe you've moved from employer to employer and you've got various different pensions all over the place. It's an opportunity to consolidate those. And then, as I said, move them over to Australia and get them into Australian dollars and get them into that tax-free environment in your retirement. So if you're in the UK for a little while before you move, I appreciate some people will have already moved that are on here. But if you're in the UK and you're preparing to make the move, there can be some things that you can do beforehand. Like, for example, try to maximise the contributions that you're making into your pension. You get full tax relief on them at the moment. And as I said earlier, we can transfer the funds over to Australia and you get them all tax-free in your retirement. So anything that you can afford to put in your pension and put away until you reach retirement age as well is an advantage, because all that tax relief that you can get on those contributions, you'll never give back. It's for once you can get one over on HMRC. It doesn't happen very often. Take advantage when you get that chance. So yeah, it's and there's various other things that you can do to prepare as well on the other financial side of things. There's different capital gains tax treatment on things like shareholdings, for example, property between the two countries, and there can be some opportunities kind of in that window as you're making the move to maximise your opportunities there. But that's something that's not really covered in this webinar is those other investments, but they're the sort of things that we can talk about with you, and certainly forms part of the financial process when you're moving from one country to another. Okay, so if you're under age 55, you can't make a transfer to Australia yet. You can't make one there until you're age 55, but there are some things that we can do to prepare for that and to help you manage your pension funds while you're living in Australia and waiting to make your transfer over there. So very often what we would do is to consolidate funds into a self-invested pension in the UK, where we can then put together a portfolio of investments for you. And we can do that in sterling, but we can also do that in Australian dollars. So if, for example, you're 45, you're moving over there, you know you can't transfer for another 10 years, but you're really keen to take that currency risk off the table, maybe you're really happy with the exchange rates at the moment. Once the funds are within that SIP, we can move those funds into Australian dollars and take that risk off the table for you, and then invest in a portfolio of Australian dollar denominated assets for you while the funds sit in the UK. So what is a SIP? So it's just a self-invested version of the personal pension, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to invest the funds yourself. We can, as I said, help you to manage that. But basically, a self-invested pension is one where you can invest in anything that is allowable under UK legislation. So there's certain things that aren't allowable, for example, directly holding a residential property within your pension, although you can hold commercial property. But we wouldn't be looking at weird and wonderful things like that. We'd be looking at just putting together a portfolio of more standard investments for you. But there's always the options for various different things. And one of the advantages of being in that SIP is that we can introduce a currency broker in there, like Halo, for example, where you can move those funds into Australian dollars at very competitive rates, and you can use those things like market orders for contracts, the session that David went through with you earlier. So if you're over, sorry, I need to move on. Yeah, so if you're over age 55, we can make a transfer to Australia. Now, it has to go to a qualifying recognised overseas pension scheme. So that will be a superannuation in Australia that has the necessary permissions from the UK to accept UK funds. And they have to adhere to certain rules during the first 5-10 years, depending on your circumstances. but those rules aren't that restrictive. They used to be quite restrictive in terms of how you could draw out of your Australian pension during that time, etc. But these days, they're not. It's not something to worry about from that point of view. It's just that the scheme that you transfer to must have those permissions. There is only one retail scheme in Australia. So what I mean by retail is you just go to a provider and you fill in an application form, and you've got one a bit like your Aviva's, Standard Lives, etc. in the UK. There's only one, and it's been specifically designed for the people that are moving from the UK. It's the Australian Expat Superannuation Fund. The other option is to set up a self-managed super fund. So it's a bit similar to the SIP that I went through just now with you, but you don't go to a provider. You have to set up a brand new scheme yourself. Although, again, we can help you. We have offices in Australia, and we have a team in Australia that deals with self-managed super funds, the setting up of them and the running of them on a name basis for you as well. But you can leave your pension in the UK. If you left it in the UK though, and then you want to draw benefits in the future, you'll have to consider that they will be taxable in Australia. Now, one thing that is not shown on this slide, but is important, even once you are 55 and we want to make the transfer over there is a limit on how much we can transfer each year. So I mentioned concessional contributions earlier in Australia, where the contribution comes off of your salary and it's taxed as it goes in. They also have something called a non-concessional contribution that allows you to make a contribution under different rules. So it goes in tax-free because it's from money that is deemed to have already had tax paid on it. So for example, if you've sold a house, you've got some money left over and you want to put it into your pension fund, it's deemed that you bought that house with earnings that you'd already been taxed on. So you have that opportunity to pay tax-free contributions as well. There is a separate limit for that to the concessional one. You can pay $120,000, where it's $120,000 as of a few days' time, because it goes up on the 1st of July. So you can pay $120,000 a year. Now you can roll up 3 years worth to make a $360,000 contribution, but you'll be using the following 2 tax years. So it'll be 3 years before you could then make another contribution. Now, when we make a transfer of a pension from the UK to Australia, it goes in as a non-concessional contribution. So we have to make sure that we're balancing what you might want to put in from other sources and what we're going to need to transfer from the UK. And if you've got a particularly large fund, probably already calculated that for a lot of you that you're going to be over that limit to transfer, so we will need to drip feed it over there, and we need to come up with a transfer strategy to do that. One thing that's really helpful is being able to restructure the pension in the UK, as I was mentioning earlier, the self-invested personal pension, have that currency control in place so that we can move into Australian dollars within the UK scheme and make sure that we're dead on that 120, that 360 we've already converted. We know that we've got the dollars, rather than the exchange rate potentially fluctuating as we go through the transfer process and you inadvertently exceeding the limit over there. So it gives us a lot more control over everything. So I've already mentioned about QROPs. I'm overrunning a little bit, so I won't labour this too much, but basically they've been in force since 2006. As I said, it allows you to make a transfer over to Australia. There have been various legislation changes, not only to QROPs, but to Australian schemes as well over the years. I already mentioned earlier the unfunded government backed schemes like the NHS that we can't transfer out of. We could before 2015, when the UK brought in more flexibility in terms of how you can draw benefits from pensions. So that wasn't a ban just on moving it to Australia, it was a ban on moving it anywhere except for to one of the other unfunded public sector schemes. So, and then various other things have happened. We used to be able to transfer to Australia at any age, but then the UK had a closer look at how QROPs were working. So they've only been in existence since 2006, and they weren't happy with Australian schemes allowing people to draw benefits under the age of 55 in circumstances other than serious ill health. So they basically just removed that QROM status that I talked about earlier from all the schemes over there, and that's why we're limited on our choices over there, but we do still have the choices. So there are these various things that we need to consider. Another thing that was brought in is the overseas transfer charge. So if you transfer your funds to a country in which you're not living, unless both yourself and that country are in the EEA, the European Economic Area, unless you're both in the EEA, then you transfer your pension to a country that you're not living in, you will lose 25% of your fund in tax to the UK government. Now, Australia seems to be part of the Eurofishing contest these days, but I don't think they're part of the EEA yet. So we would need to be careful about making the transfer over there, and make sure that you're settled as well. So a lot of people will be rushing you to make a transfer over there, particularly if they plug something with the 6-month rule, where you can make a transfer over there and there's no tax to pay on it. If you make a transfer after 6 months, there is some element of tax, but it will only be to the difference between what your funds were at the day you went to Australia and what it's worth when you make the transfer. So it's only the growth that's been achieved since you were in Australia. So people will rush you, but if you were to transfer your pension over to Australia and then you come back to the UK in 5 years, then your fund will be stuck in Australia because the Australian authorities don't allow you to make a transfer back. So you would end up being subject to that overseas transfer charge. So there's lots of these legislation changes that we need to work with, but we're always on top of them. We usually get a lot of notice about them as well, so we can prepare. But it's just something to consider that, you know, with somebody like ourselves on board, we can help you through that process and make sure that we adapt strategies as and when these things happen. So I've already taken you through the QROPS a little bit, so I won't labour that point. So the BDH Sterling transfer process, so you can contact us, we can have a free initial meeting, so we would conduct that by video, and we can have a good old chat about your situation, work out what it is that you need help with, and then obviously talk to you about potentially working with us if it's deemed suitable, and then tell you, you know, about the cost for that depending on your situation. If you then do decide that you want to go ahead with our service, then we will go and get all the information that we need from yourselves, and from your pension companies, from your other investments, if we're looking at those as well. Make sure that we really understand those, and then we will do the necessary analysis and provide you with a report that will go through everything with you, including my specific recommendations as to what you should do, and coming up with a transfer strategy, etc. If it's a good idea to make a transfer of that pension. We can then sit down and again by video and go through the report, discuss that in detail, and then if you did decide that you wanted to go ahead with any recommendations that we've made, we can manage that whole process for you as well. So I've already mentioned a few of the pitfalls, including the overseas transfer charge that I talked about just now. If you did transfer, I think it's unlikely that you've managed to do it because the pension schemes are very on it in terms of making sure that you're not being scammed by anybody or anything like that. But if you were able to make a transfer of your pension to a scheme that doesn't have that QROP status, for example, then you would lose 55% of your fund in tax to HMRC. Is you'd be going to a non-compliant scheme. So there are some pretty hefty penalties if you don't get this right, but that's fine. We know what we're doing. I've been personally doing this for 15 years, as well as being around pensions for 30 years. But I've been specifically helping people to move to Australia for 15 years. So I'd like to think I know what I'm doing by now, and can make sure that you're not subject to any of these penalties when you make the transfer. So just finally, why BDH Sterling? We are a chartered financial planner in the UK, but we also have offices in Australia. We can help people wherever they're moving in Australia, but specifically we have offices in Sydney and Perth. We have advisors based elsewhere as well. As I said, we've got teams out there that deal with the self-managed super funds. We also have a specific pension transfer team. And then we have other teams that are dealing with all the other financial aspects that you might have when you move over there. So this isn't just about transferring your pension or transferring other assets from the UK. You might want the ongoing financial advice in Australia to help you set up all your finances over there, to manage them throughout the rest of your life. So we've got the necessary advisors over there, the teams to back up those advisors over there, just like we do in the UK. As I said, I've personally got 15 years experience in doing the pension transfers to Australia. The directors of BDH Sterling actually have more years than that. They go back to actually, they were making transfers before those QOPs rules came in. It's a lot more complex back then, but they've been there right from the moment the QOPs came out. So as I said, we can help with all sorts of aspects of your move over there from a financial point of view. If you wanted to chat to us, it's just inquiries@bdhsterling.com. Drop us an email, and we'll be happy to arrange one of those free initial conversations. Generally, I allow half an hour to go through just that initial conversation with you. Make sure that we identify what actually needs doing, and you know, obviously give you a better idea of our service, our costs, etc. So that's the end of what I had to say. So we are moving on to questions and answers section now. One thing, just in the chat, somebody put in there, kindly send us the recording. The recording will be available after this session. It may take a little while to put it together, but it will be available for you. So moving to the questions and answers. I will just take a quick sip of water first. It's quite warm in this room. So first one is, what are the tax implications of moving a final salary pension scheme to Australia? Hopefully I've gone through that a little bit, but basically, as I said earlier, if you have a scheme in the UK and you are living in Australia and you draw from that UK scheme, it will be taxed in Australia. If you move the funds over there and you draw on them from the superannuation scheme, then they will be tax-free. So there is potentially, as I said, a little element of tax to pay on the transfer, depending on how long you've been in Australia, but it will only ever be the growth on that fund from when you entered Australia to the time you make the transfer. Or if you previously made a transfer, we're having to drip feed the funds, it will be from the last transfer. Can you recommend a UK SIPP for managing GBP AUD FX risk within a UK pension before a plan move to Australia if I want to move between GBP and AUD cash at competitive market rates, and then for FX forwards outside a SIPP are not suitable for me, e.g. move date more than 2 years away? Well, yes, I mean, I've covered that we can use the SIPPs, we can make a recommendation for that, we can put currency broker within there, we deal with that sort of thing all the time. So so that's certainly something that we can help with. I see David nodding his head there, constantly getting requests from us to convert funds within a pension.
Yeah, I was just thinking if
that want the added legislation involved in pension schemes, I should think, David.
I was just thinking in terms of if the move is more than 2 years away, as I mentioned earlier, it's only worth doing that and starting to move the funds around within a SIPP or otherwise, if you absolutely are certain that you're going. As I say, if you've started to buy Australian dollars and the exchange rate moved in the wrong direction, you might find yourself in a situation where you've got a loss if you had to convert that back to sterling. So, you know, it absolutely needs to rely on a guarantee that you are moving, and there's no way that's not going to happen. So that's my only sort of caveat to that.
So there's a lot of questions in here that I imagine were put in here before I went through everything. So, for example, somebody asked whether NHS pensions are transferable. Unfortunately, not. What is the process for transferring pension? Hopefully, I've covered that as well. If I haven't, if you've got any questions, again, just drop me an email, inquiries@VDH Sterling, and somebody will be in contact there. What is the best age to transfer your pension? As I said earlier, you can't transfer to Australia until age 55. When you then do it post age 55 will depend on a number of factors. For example, if you've got a particularly large pension fund, we might want to start that process straight away when you reach age 55. So we've got enough years at that $120,000 that we can transfer to be able to get as much of your fund over there as possible before you want to draw it. So yeah, what is the best age is very much dependent on personal circumstances. So whenever we're doing any work with somebody, it would be very much a case of looking at their circumstances, working with them as an individual, because much as you know, some of the issues and the opportunities, etc., are the same for everybody. Clearly, not everybody's circumstances are the same. So, you know, what suits one person might not suit another person. So we need to make sure we go through that process properly with people. Another person has asked, if your final salary scheme transfer is over 700,000, do you have to set up two funds, one in Australia and the other in the UK? Well, you'd have to anyway. You'd have to set up a superannuation scheme in Australia that has the necessary QOP status. And then what we would generally do is if we've identified, having gone through all the projections, etc., that a transfer is suitable to you, because yeah, sometimes staying in your final salary scheme would be the better option. But if we have identified that a transfer is suitable, what we would generally do is to move it to another UK scheme first, where we can then introduce that currency control, manage the investments for you over here, and then we would have to drip feed a fund of that size over there within those limits in Australia. And so we need to come up with a transfer strategy. And being that your fund is particularly large, we might, within that strategy, build in other things. So, for example, if we were making transfer of $360,000 over there, if we were using that 3-year roll-up that I talked about earlier, we might also get the scheme to pay you a bit of pension commencement lump sum, that 25% that you can receive tax-free from the UK, but just 25% in relation to it. So, for example, we would crystallise, as it's called, $480,000 worth of your fund in the UK. 25% of that 120 would go to your bank account. The other 360 would go to your Australian scheme, and that's a way of reducing your fund quicker in the UK, getting the funds over to Australia quicker. But that doesn't suit everybody. Not everybody needs $120,000 paid to their bank account that they can't then pay into the superannuation because we've already maxed out the contribution limit. You know, when you first leave the UK as well, we need to do inheritance tax. So there is no inheritance tax in Australia, but whatever you do to break your UK domicile for inheritance tax purposes, you will still be liable to, your estate will still be liable to inheritance tax for at least 3 complete UK tax years after you leave. Now, there is talk of that moving to 10 years of residency overseas. So we need to consider that pensions are protected from inheritance tax. Whereas if we've paid out 120,000 to your bank account, or maybe done that multiple times through the transfer strategy, if you're still within that period where your estate is liable to inheritance tax on your worldwide assets, we need to consider that that might be an issue, taking money out of the pension scheme. So there's lots of things to consider, but yes, we would set up a new UK scheme to transfer that final salary scheme to, and we would then set up a scheme in Australia that allows the transfer. The next question is, can an existing Australian SMSF satisfy the test to be a QROPS, or is a bespoke new one required? An existing one will be fine, as long as all the members of that scheme are 55 or over. So if all the members are 55 or over, you would be able to apply to HMRC in the UK for QOP status. But if you might be looking at making a transfer yourself because you're already age 55, but maybe your partner's in there and they're only age 53 at the time, you wouldn't be able to get QOP status on that self-managed super fund as a result. All the members need to be age 55 or above. And that's the main reason why the only retail scheme is the Australian Expat Superannuation Fund, because you can't join that scheme until you're age 55. So naturally, they have no members in that scheme that are under age 55, and therefore they've got the QOP status. Other schemes over there, when this was being assessed by the UK government, as I said, we used to be able to transfer at any age, and there were loads of schemes over there with QOP status. Those schemes tried to change their rules to say that if somebody had transferred funds from the UK, that they weren't allowed to access them until they're age 55 unless they were in serious ill health. But that fell on deaf ears as far as the UK government was concerned. I think their opinion was that the overarching legislation in Australia allows you to draw benefits under the age of 55, and therefore just individual scheme rules might not be strong enough. So yeah, you can. That's your existing SMSF will be fine. Self-managed super fund for those people in the webinar. But you, as I said, you won't be able to get QOP status unless you're 55. Another one, could you recommend a specific UK SIP provider for this? Yes, I could. But again, like I was saying earlier, everybody's circumstances are different. So again, we are independent financial advisors. That independence is slightly limited by the fact that we're dealing in a niche market, but we do have plenty of opportunities available to us. It will very much depend on your circumstances and what we're trying to achieve, this size of your funds, etc., as to which SIP provider we would use, but we will make a specific recommendation for that and the investments within it, and etc. Next one, paying tax in Australia after paying tax in UK on your pension. No. So what you'll probably find is that when you first start drawing that pension, so for example, state pension and final salary scheme that you might have left behind, etc. When you first start drawing it, you might be taxed in the UK. There is a double taxation agreement between the two countries, so you'll be able to get credit for that on your Australian tax return. But you will be able to then apply to have your tax code changed in the UK to a nil tax code. So, as I said, even if your pension is being paid in quite a number of years' time, you've already lived abroad, and you would have thought you could do that in advance. It's generally only once the payroll has been set up for your pension, because pensions are paid under PAYE, just like your employment earnings. So it's generally only once that payroll's been set up that you would then be able to apply to have it changed to a nil tax code. But then you would be receiving it gross in the UK, and you just account for it in Australia. As I said, though, if you have paid in tax in the UK, there is a double taxation agreement, so you would be able to get credit against your Australian tax return. Next one, if you're living in Australia, can you drop money into UK pension to offset any UK tax on earnings there? Then transfer to Oz for tax-free income. I need to understand your circumstances in your question a little bit better in order to answer that. Let's have a chat. Drop us an email at inquiries@bbhsterling.com, and we'll have a chat about that. I think it's quite a specific thing. So yeah, it's one of those questions that quite often come up in webinars, but I think it's something that's very specific to you by the sounds of it, so we need to talk about it individually. Next one, if you transfer funds, e.g. Australian 360,000 to QOPs fund, how is the remaining UK SIP growth taxed in Australia? Well, it grows tax-free initially, it continues to grow tax-free in the UK. It's not accessible on an ongoing basis in Australia. But when you make the next transfer over to Australia, they will look at the difference between your fund at the time that you last made a transfer and the time that you made that new transfer to Australia. So that difference in fund, any growth that you've achieved since you last made the transfer, that will be taxed in Australia. Now, it will either be taxed at your marginal rates, which could be quite high if you're a high earner, or it would be taxed at 15% if we do it the right way. So you can get your superannuation fund to pay at 15%, but there are certain rules around that, that if you don't get them right, you would end up having to add that gain to your tax return and pay it at income tax rate. So we need to be careful about that, but basically that's how it works. And the main reason for that is that, as I said earlier, the funds in Australia, the superannuation funds, are taxed as they go along on the growth. So they just don't want you to be in a position where you've left your funds for ages in the UK in a tax-free environment and you never have to pay any tax on that growth, because it puts you at an advantage over in Australia. There is a slight advantage in having it roll up gross each year and then pay the tax of 15% rather than the 15% taken off every year, but you're still paying the tax, and so we do need to make sure that we get it right when we do that. Now, I mentioned the non-concessional contribution limit earlier, and your question mentioned it as well, that 360,000 if you roll up 3 years worth. Any growth that is taxed, that is transferred over there, because that's a taxable thing, that goes in addition to that non-concessional contribution. But when you make that non-concessional contribution, you must transfer the growth with it as well. You can't just leave the growth in the UK when you make that transfer. So again, something that we can talk about in detail as we go through a transfer strategy for you. I think we've got a couple in the chat as well. It's just people saying thank you. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Actually, one person does say in there, can you take your 25% tax-free pension allowance in the UK, then transfer the balance to a QOP scheme at a flat 15% on the growth? So one thing that I haven't mentioned, I mentioned taking the 25% earlier as part of the transfer process, but one thing that I didn't mention is that that's part of the transfer process. So you would have, so the 480,000 I was talking about earlier was crystallizing it. 25% goes over to your bank account. The other 75% is 360 that we transfer over there. That's fine, because that means these crystallized funds have all gone over there. HMRC in the UK has a rule that you're not allowed to make a partial transfer from a crystallized fund. So if you had a large fund and you've taken 25% out as your pension commencement lump sum, and the 75% that's left in your scheme is then classed as crystallized, which basically means you've already taken your lump sum from it and the rest is taxable. If that 75% is all, it remains in there, it's all crystallized and it's over the non-concessional contribution limit in Australia, we're going to get stuck between the two pieces of legislation, because HMRC doesn't allow you to make a partial transfer, but your fund is too big to transfer it to Australia in one go. So we need to be very careful about that. It doesn't mean you can't take your 25%. There are ways that we can go about it to ensure that you can still take it if you need it. But again, we need to come up with a strategy for that to ensure that we don't scupper the chances of an onward transfer. And the second question is, UK SIPP allows withdrawal at age 58. Is this the same for QROBs? That's a good question. It's something that I didn't mention earlier. The age for drawing from the SIPP is 55 at the moment. It's going up to 57 in a couple of years' time. And it may well go up further in the future, but at the moment it's age 55, which is why you're not allowed to make a transfer to Australia until you're age 55, because that's the minimum pension age in the UK. In Australia, for pretty much everybody these days, it's age 60. So you can't actually draw benefits from an Australian superannuation scheme until you're age 60. And if you're still working at that time, there is a limit on how much you can draw out of that scheme. You can go into something called transition retirement, but that means that you can only draw out 10% of your scheme each year. Once you get to age 65, it doesn't matter whether you're working or not. You can draw it out the whole fund if you wanted to in one go. Same thing if you're between 60 and 65 and you've fully retired. Again, you have full flexibility there. But if you're looking to draw benefits when you're still working, then you will be a little bit limited between 60 and 65. So yeah, that was a good question and something that I hadn't covered earlier. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the questions and answers because I think we might be done now. Yeah, that's everything. Apologies, David. Well, I'm not the one asking the questions, but you didn't have a lot to say in the questions and answers section. But thank you for joining us today, everybody, and David, thank you for your contribution.
Absolute pleasure.
As I said, we're done on all the questions that you've had. So yeah, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you're living at the moment.
Thank you, everyone.